A quiet mechanic helps a struggling woman and her son without asking for anything in return. Days later, luxury cars begin arriving at his dusty garage, and among them is a familiar face. What she reveals changes everything. This isn't just about fixing cars, it's about rebuilding lives. Prescott, Arizona. The year was 2012. The air hung dry and still, clinging to the cracked pavement and drifting between buildings baked under a relentless sun. Dust gathered at the edges of sidewalks where patches of worn grass struggled to grow. The rhythm of the town was slow and familiar, marked by the distant hum of trucks on the highway, the hiss of coffee machines in old diners, and the soft jingle of coins falling into vending machines outside gas stations. On the edge of town, just off Route 89, stood a weathered building with flaking paint and a faded sign that read, "Tom's Garage." The windows were streaked with age, the walls patched and repainted more times than anyone could count. Inside, the air carried the heavy scent of oil, grease, and time. The shop was cluttered with toolboxes, spare parts, and a coffee maker that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. It was a place where the clock seemed to tick a little slower, where the world didn't rush, and where silence was only broken by the clank of metal and the occasional barking of an old dog. Tom Davis, age 54, arrived each morning before sunrise. He wore the same frayed jeans and oil-stained button-down shirt, a cap pulled low over his brow. His hands, hardened by decades of labor, bore the black stains of engines long since broken down and rebuilt. He moved without hurry, but with a kind of quiet determination that had settled into his bones. He was not a man of speeches or declarations. He did what needed to be done, even when no one was watching, even when the money barely covered the bills. 5 years had passed since his wife's death. The grief had softened with time, but the emptiness remained, a quiet companion in the quiet evenings. He lived alone in a small house not far from the shop. His only regular company, a loyal mutt named Spark, who slept in the back of the garage during the day and curled up at his feet by night. Spark had once been a stray, much like Tom felt some days, forgotten, overlooked, but still here. Business had declined steadily over the years. The big-name service centers in nearby Flagstaff and Prescott Valley lured customers with flashy advertisements and bright waiting rooms with free Wi-Fi and coffee. Tom had none of that. His shop was honest but outdated, built on reputation and handshake deals. He refused to cut corners, refused to upsell parts people didn't need. That integrity kept his conscience clean but his bank account thin. Each morning, Tom lifted the garage door with a slow creak and stepped into the same worn routine. He checked the messages on the old answering machine, usually empty, then turned on the overhead lights, which buzzed for a moment before flickering to life. Some days, a neighbor stopped by for a tire check or an oil change. Other days, no one came at all. Still, Tom kept the place running. He swept the floors, organized the tools, adjusted the signage outside, and waited. Not for miracles or success, just for a car to pull into the gravel lot, for someone to need what he could offer. And though he would never admit it aloud, he held on to a sliver of hope that something might shift, that life still had room for surprises. Because even when everything seemed worn out, his tools, his building, his heart, he believed that as long as he showed up, the story wasn't finished. It was one of those spring days in Prescott when the sun bore down like it had something to prove. The air shimmered above the pavement, and heat curled off the hoods of cars like smoke from a low fire. The town moved slower in such weather. People stayed inside. Shops kept their doors propped open with fans humming at full speed. Tom was wiping his hands with a rag, the smell of grease thick around him, when he heard the struggling wheeze of an engine nearing its last breath. An old Chrysler minivan, sun-bleached and dented from years of hard use, crawled onto the gravel in front of the garage. A trail of steam hissed from under the hood, and a thin line of coolant dripped onto the dirt, creating dark circles that spread and disappeared. The van rolled to a stop with a soft rattle and a final groan from the engine. Inside, a woman sat at the wheel, her posture tight, shoulders drawn up with tension. She looked to be in her early 40s, her face drawn with exhaustion that didn't come just from driving. The kind of fatigue she wore came from too many days of trying to hold everything together. Her clothes were plain, slightly wrinkled, not dirty, but lived in. In the back seat, a boy clutched a faded blue backpack tightly against his chest. He couldn't have been older than 10. His face was blank, not from boredom, but from the quiet vigilance of a child who had learned to stay out of the way. The woman stepped out slowly, as though the ground itself might shift beneath her feet. She glanced up at the garage, at the cracked paint and rusted signage, perhaps questioning if this place could really help her. Dust clung to her shoes and the hem of her jeans. She didn't move toward the building right away, instead walking around to look at the front of the van, shielding her eyes from the sunlight as steam continued to billow up. Tom had seen a lot of cars limp their way onto his lot, but this one told a story even before he opened the hood. The suspension sagged noticeably at the rear, suggesting overloaded travel. The tires were mismatched, one nearly bald. The front bumper had a deep crack sealed with duct tape. It was a vehicle held together by stubbornness and necessity, not by maintenance. When he approached to inspect the engine, the problem was immediately clear. The radiator was beyond repair, split along the top and leaking freely. The belts were worn, one dangerously frayed. The brake pads were nearly gone, and the back axle groaned when he shifted the weight of the vehicle. It hadn't just broken down. It had barely held on long enough to make it here. As Tom examined the damage, the woman stood silently nearby, her eyes scanning his face, trying to read his thoughts before he even spoke. There was something about her stance that hinted at pride tempered by desperation. She wasn't begging. She was surviving, and barely. It didn't take much for Tom to piece the rest together. They were traveling west. The van was packed with belongings, visible through the side windows: boxes, clothes, a stack of children's books, and a rolled-up sleeping bag. They hadn't planned to stop here. They had no choice. Whatever savings they had were likely gone, spent on gas, food, maybe motels, when the car still ran well enough to reach them. Tom thought of his own empty fridge, the past due notices tucked under his ledger, the property taxes he hadn't paid since December. Every practical part of him told him to walk away, to point her toward the next town, the next shop. But something held him there, something quieter and heavier than logic. He remembered the soft way his wife used to place a hand on his back when he was too deep in his thoughts. He remembered the promise they made long ago, to help when they could, to not become hardened by the world's indifference. It came back in a rush, uninvited but insistent. So he wiped his hands again, walked back toward the garage, and gathered the tools he knew he would need. The job wouldn't be easy. It would cost him time, parts, maybe even customers he couldn't afford to lose if other work came in. But the decision had already settled inside him, quiet and firm. He didn't ask for names. He didn't ask what brought them here. He just rolled up his sleeves and opened the toolbox. The desert sun beat down on the roof of the shop. The boy sat silently in the van, and Tom got to work. Tom spent the next 3 days almost entirely inside the garage, working through the heat, the silence, and the tight ache in his lower back that never quite went away. The old Chrysler sat on the lift like a patient in critical condition, its undercarriage exposed, bolts loosened, parts scattered across the concrete floor like pieces of a puzzle he knew by heart. The tools in his hands moved with muscle memory. There was no music playing, no conversation, no plan beyond the next bolt, the next leak, the next small victory over rust and wear. The replacement radiator wasn't new. It was one he had salvaged months ago from a wrecked pickup, belonging to a neighbor who had traded in the body for scrap. Tom had planned to use it for his own side project, an old Dodge sitting behind the shed, but plans didn't matter now. He checked the seals, flushed out the lines, and dropped it into place with careful hands. It wasn't perfect, but it would work. When he inspected the tires, he found uneven wear and a slow leak in the rear passenger side. Rather than patch it, he pulled 2 used tires off another old car parked in the lot, ones with better tread and enough life left in them to give the woman a safer ride. The brake pads, nearly metal on metal, were replaced with a set he kept for emergencies. Every part he installed cost him something, not always money, but value, future repairs, what little backup inventory he had left. In the evenings, as the sun dipped low and cast long orange streaks across the workbenches, he could see the boy sitting quietly in the trailer parked behind the shop. It had once belonged to a customer who couldn't pay, left behind like a forgotten promise. Now, it gave the woman and her son shelter, at least for a few nights. Tom didn't ask how they were doing. He didn't bring food or try to make conversation. He just let them be, offering space and time instead of questions. On the second night, a storm rolled in from the mountains, unexpected and brief. Rain tapped against the tin roof, washing away the dust in small rivers. Inside the garage, Tom worked under the flicker of an old fluorescent light, tightening bolts with rainwater dripping from the sleeves of his shirt. The storm passed, leaving the air cooler and the scent of wet asphalt strong enough to cut through the grease. By the third day, the Chrysler was whole again. Not brand new, not showroom perfect, but solid. The engine turned over on the first try, the belts hummed smoothly, the brakes responded cleanly. Tom let it idle in the bay, listening closely for any rattle or whistle that shouldn't be there. Satisfied, he lowered the lift and parked it out front under the shade of a mesquite tree. He didn't wait for them to leave. He simply left the keys on the dashboard and went inside to wipe down his tools and start sweeping the floor. By the time he returned to the workbench, they were gone. The trailer door had been shut neatly behind them, the gravel outside freshly disturbed. On the corner of his bench, he found a small paper bag folded at the top, warm to the touch, and a handwritten note tucked under it. Inside were a half-dozen homemade cookies, slightly misshapen, wrapped in a napkin. The note was short, written in careful cursive. It didn't say much, just thank you, and a few words that Tom didn't read twice. He folded it, slid it into the drawer with the spare fuses, and stood there for a moment, looking at the empty lot. The sun was beginning to set again, long rays reaching across the floor like fingers. He moved slowly, back to the rhythm he knew best, tidying tools, organizing sockets, wiping his hands on the same rag. Outside, the town moved on. Inside the garage, the silence returned, broken only by the distant creak of the wind and the soft scuff of his boots across the floor. Nothing had changed, and yet something had. A week had passed since the woman and her son had driven away, and Tom had returned to his usual pace. The garage felt quieter than before, though he couldn't explain why. The days passed in familiar cycles, opening the doors before sunrise, checking for new work, tending to what little came through. Then one morning, something unusual stirred the gravel outside. A brand new Ford Explorer pulled into the lot with precise slowness, the tires crunching over the stones with a muted authority. The paint gleamed, untouched by dust or weather. From the driver's side stepped a man in a dark suit, his shoes too polished for a town like Prescott, his posture straight and assured. Another man followed him, younger but dressed similarly, each step measured. They looked out of place against the backdrop of rusted signs and old pickup trucks. They didn't head straight for the office. Instead, they walked the perimeter of the property, examining the building, the tools visible through the open doors, the fading signage. Within minutes, more vehicles arrived. An Escalade, a Mercedes, a Tesla with gull-wing doors. The small lot, which normally held a couple of aging sedans and a delivery van or two, was suddenly filled with machines Tom had only seen in magazines. Their sleek forms reflected the sunlight, creating a strange sense of distortion, like the garage had been pulled into another world. Tom stood in the doorway, rag still in hand, watching in silence. None of it made sense. These were not customers. These were people who lived in cities where appointments were scheduled by assistants and suits were tailored weekly. One of the suited men eventually approached him carrying a slim black folder with silver-embossed lettering. Without ceremony, he handed it over and stepped back. Inside, Tom found documents printed on thick, expensive paper. The language was formal but clear. An offer to invest in the garage, to modernize the equipment, to expand the facility into something more than it had ever been. There were architectural plans, grant proposals, a handwritten note of recommendation, and an invitation to a business meeting in Phoenix. It was as if someone had written a new future for his shop and printed it in perfect ink. Before he could absorb it all, a door clicked open on the last car to arrive. A glossy black sedan parked quietly near the edge of the lot. A woman stepped out, composed and purposeful. She wore a tailored coat that caught the breeze just enough to show its quality. Her hair was neatly styled, her boots polished, her movements calm and self-assured. She looked nothing like the exhausted traveler he had seen days before, the woman who had watched him work in silence as her child sat alone in the back seat. Yet it was her. Her presence shifted something in the air. She approached with quiet confidence, acknowledging the men around her with slight nods. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she waited for Tom to recognize her, to process what was unfolding. Her posture carried no arrogance, only certainty. In that moment, Tom understood she had not returned to repay a debt, but to fulfill a decision. Her name was Sarah McGraw, and it turned out she was far more than a woman passing through. She was the heir to a nationwide chain of automotive dealerships, a name known in cities across the country. She had left her corporate life behind after the sudden loss of her husband, putting trusted partners in charge while she and her son traveled without a fixed plan. She had wanted distance, perspective, and truth. Somewhere between the cracked pavement of a small-town garage and a mechanic who hadn't asked for anything in return, she had found what she was looking for. She had watched him work, not just with tools, but with quiet conviction. She had seen someone who helped because he could, not because he should. And that, to her, had value greater than any balance sheet. Her vision was clear. She wanted Tom's garage to become the foundation for something larger. A place where single parents could get their cars fixed for free, where veterans wouldn't be turned away, and where teenagers who had slipped through the cracks of the system could learn a trade, find structure, and rebuild their confidence. She would provide the funding. He would provide the heart. It wouldn't carry her name or her company's logo. Everything would remain under Tom's banner. She wanted no publicity, no press release, no ceremony, only action. And so, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary morning, surrounded by vehicles that had never belonged in Prescott, Tom stood on the edge of a decision he hadn't seen coming. The woman he once knew only as a stranded driver now stood as the architect of a future he never imagined, offering him not just money or recognition, but purpose. Construction began one quiet morning under a sky streaked with pale orange. A month had passed since Sarah McGraw's return, and in that time plans had been drawn, contracts signed, and crews assembled. The old garage, which had stood for decades like a stubborn monument to another era, was quickly surrounded by scaffolding and noise. Workers in hard hats moved with practiced rhythm, unloading steel beams, solar panels, and crates of unfamiliar equipment. The demolition happened in stages. First, the walls came down, revealing the bones of the place Tom had once built with his own hands. Then the roof, long patched and repatched, was peeled away. He stood to the side, arms crossed, watching each blow of the sledgehammer echo across the lot. Dust clung to his boots as memories surfaced with each falling panel. It was like burying an old friend, not with grief, but with quiet acceptance. In place of crumbling drywall and rusted lifts rose smooth concrete, clean lines, and wide windows that let in the morning light. The new garage had a front office with comfortable seating, digital diagnostic tools, energy-efficient lifts, and a wall of tools that gleamed under LED strips. Solar panels covered the roof. An insulated back room was added for teaching, equipped with workbenches, diagrams, and parts neatly labeled in drawers. Tom moved through the new space cautiously at first, uncertain of where he belonged. The walls were too clean, the air too sterile. Gone were the oil-stained floors and that familiar creak in the floorboard near the back bench. He caught himself reaching for tools that no longer lived in their old drawers. It was disorienting, as if someone had handed him a newer version of his own life and expected him to inhabit it without hesitation. Then the first group of teens arrived. They came awkwardly, some in oversized hoodies, some with headphones wrapped around their necks, their eyes lowered and their hands buried deep in their pockets. A few had been referred by local schools. Others came through word of mouth or at the urging of exhausted guardians. Most didn't speak much at first. They watched Tom with quiet curiosity, unsure of what this place was supposed to be. Tom saw something in them, something he recognized. The reluctance, the anger, the stubborn shell that formed when the world stopped giving second chances. He didn't talk at them or try to inspire with speeches. Instead, he handed them rags, socket wrenches, and oil filters. He showed them how to change spark plugs, how to lift a car safely, how to keep a workspace clean. He corrected them firmly, but without judgment. And over time, they began to come alive under the structure he offered. They asked questions. They started showing up early. One by one, their confidence began to grow, not through praise, but through the satisfaction of learning something real. They learned to hold themselves with quiet pride, to take responsibility for their mistakes, and to fix what they broke. Tom watched them as he once watched his younger self, trying to build something with their hands because nothing else around them felt solid. News of the project began to spread beyond Prescott. A local reporter ran a short piece in the Sunday edition about the transformation of an old mechanic shop into a training center. Then came the regional papers, then a radio segment. People drove in from nearby towns, some out of curiosity, others because they had heard this place didn't turn anyone away. Tom became, reluctantly, a public figure. His photo appeared in articles and his story was told in classrooms and community halls. But he never changed his routine. He still swept the floors each morning and still worked with grease on his knuckles. When reporters asked for statements, he gave them short answers. When photographers showed up, he stood stiffly and waited for it to be over. The building received a nameplate near the entrance, a place to help. Tom hadn't chosen the words himself, but when he saw them, he didn't ask for changes. They were simple, honest, and true. People came not just for repairs, but for advice, for work, for a moment of clarity in lives otherwise defined by chaos. The garage became a place of trust, its bright walls and clean tools a kind of quiet promise. And in the center of it all stood Tom, no longer just the man who fixed engines, but the one who had built something that others could stand on. A year had passed since the transformation of the garage. In March, under the soft bloom of early spring on the East Coast, Tom found himself in Washington, D.C., standing beneath a vaulted ceiling inside a grand ceremonial hall. He wore a suit that felt stiffer than any jumpsuit he had ever owned, the fabric unfamiliar against his skin. His boots, though polished for the occasion, still bore the creases of daily wear. In his jacket pocket, a folded piece of paper rested against his chest. His prepared remarks, written late the night before in his motel room, though he already suspected he wouldn't use them. The room was filled with chairs in straight lines, spotlights illuminating the podium at center stage, and the subtle hum of cameras waiting to capture the moment. Community leaders, nonprofit directors, and policymakers filled the seats dressed in suits and dresses, name badges clipped to their collars. The applause had already begun as Tom stepped forward, modest and steady, his eyes searching for something familiar. He found it in the front row. Sarah sat poised, her expression calm and proud. Beside her, her son, now taller, more confident, wore the dark blue hoodie of a technical college. His hands were folded, his posture respectful, but there was a spark of recognition in his eyes when he met Tom's gaze. It reminded Tom of the boy in the back seat of a broken-down minivan and of how far they had all come since then. When Tom reached the microphone, he didn't unfold the paper. He simply looked out across the room and began to speak, his voice low and roughened by years of weather and engines. He didn't speak in practiced rhetoric or polished lines. Instead, he spoke the way he had always worked, plainly, truthfully, with weight behind every word. He spoke of the silence that follows loss, of the long days in a quiet shop where it seemed no one would ever come through the door. He spoke of the decision to help, not because it was convenient, but because it was necessary. He spoke of a woman and her son, of rusted bolts and empty pockets, and how something small, one act, one moment, could lead to something none of them had seen coming. The room listened, and then the room stood. The applause was thunderous, long, unhurried. Tom lowered his head slightly in acknowledgement, then stepped away from the podium. He didn't linger on the stage. He never had liked too much attention. But the moment stayed with him, not for the noise or the setting, but for what it meant, that what had started in the dust and heat of a small Arizona town had reached far beyond it. The following day, on the drive back to Prescott, Tom took a detour off the interstate and pulled into a small roadside motel that hadn't changed in years. The parking lot was cracked, the paint on the office door faded. This was where he had once bartered for a rusted hydraulic lift, paying cash he could hardly spare. He sat by the window of the motel cafe, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him, and watched the trucks pass on the highway. The desert beyond the glass shimmered in the afternoon sun, the same as it always had. The world outside looked unchanged, dry, stubborn, quiet. But Tom felt different. He was no longer just fixing what others left broken. He was building something that would outlast him. Back in Prescott, a week later, a new sign was installed atop the garage. The lettering was forged in dark brushed steel, bold against the clean lines of the new building. It read, Davis and Sons. There was no ceremony, no ribbon cutting. The workers mounted it with quiet precision, checked their bolts, and moved on. Tom stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, looking up at the name. He had no children, no biological sons to carry his name. But over the past year, dozens of young people had passed through his shop, learning, working, growing. They had asked questions, made mistakes, and come back again. Some of them had started jobs elsewhere. Others were still finding their way. But all of them had left a mark on the place. They were, in every way that mattered, his legacy. Inside the shop, the tools were back in place. The floors were clean, the air cool, the hum of focused work in every corner. Tom stepped through the doorway, past the new front desk and the fresh coat of paint. In the break room, a worn-out notebook sat on the table. He flipped it open and began sketching, not out of necessity, but out of vision. The next build, the next expansion, the next generation. He wasn't done, not even close.